Hi, you're listening to a new episode of East Meets West. I am your host, Flamehawk.
And I am the gentleman Snark.
Thank you for listening to us on WXCI 91.7 FM Danbury or on our website, nerdent.net. Today we have a very exciting guest on the show as we interview David Pepose on his new comic, Spencer Locke, and also his experience in the reviewing realm.
Yeah, so be sure to tune in and listen to us as we dive in and get some lovely opinion on the expertise on both comic writing and news and comic book reviewing. So, very interesting spin on that. So, without further ado, let's get right into it.
How did you first get into comics?
Oh, man. I first got into comics. My mother bought me 4 Marvel comics when I was in preschool. She bought me an issue of Spider-Man, Captain America, Silver Surfer, and the Hulk. And that Spider-Man issue especially, I really adored. But it was when my mother finally got me Infinity War #2. And that's when I realized, all these characters, they live in the same world. And that really just that blew my young mind. And that kind of started a lifelong passion for comics.
So, would it be safe to say that you are a Marvel man?
It's funny. I actually would probably say the opposite. My first professional level kind of gig in the industry, I interned over at DC Comics in their editorial department, and there's a lot to love about both companies. I feel like DC, it's more formalist. It's all about the metaphor and these sort of human problems on superhuman scale. Whereas Marvel, it's almost like jazz. It's very naturalistic, and it's all about these very human characters with feet of clay and very relatable flaws. So it's I guess for me it's like would you want to listen to one style of music for the rest of your life? For me, if anything, I like having sort of that diversity of storytelling, because if I ever sort of get a little tired of one, I can lean into the other one.
Yep, there's definitely room for both.
Yeah.
What is Spencer Locke?
Sure. Well, Spencer Locke, our easy elevator pitch is, it's what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City? It's about a hard-boiled cop who's investigating a murder, and it turns out that his partner is his childhood imaginary friend. So our story, it's a little bit of True Detective, a little bit of Fight Club, and it's a 4-issue crime noir series that I think really pushes the boundaries of what the genre can hold.
Now, there's been a lot of fan reaction, and most of it's been positive. Is there any room for more after the 4 issues?
Oh man, you know what? If the desire is there, I would certainly love it. I think we've got at least another 2, maybe even 3 arcs in us, and it really all depends on the fans. I think. If the fans show that there is a demand for more Spencer and Locke, I certainly wouldn't want to tell them no.
What is the dynamic between the two characters, Spencer and Locke?
Sure. Well, it's very much in that sort of buddy cop kind of DNA, like you've seen in Lethal Weapon or True Detective, or even more irreverent takes like Rush Hour. So you have Detective Locke, who, he grew up in a very hard neighborhood and in some pretty harrowing circumstances. And a big part of what our story investigates is, why does he need an imaginary friend all the way into his adulthood? And it's because he was scarred pretty badly as a child, and playing him off of Spencer, his imaginary talking panther. There's this great chemistry to the two of them that I really adore. They're very much sort of yin and yang to one another. Whereas, Locke is kind of this vicious, scrappy little guy. Spencer is sort of this big, hulking protector figure who, underneath all the fur and claws and rippling muscle, I mean, he's just a softy underneath. Spencer really represents a lot of things to Locke as, being a figment of his imagination, sort of his animal instincts as a detective, but also sort of his warmth and his sense of humor, and even at times his very humanity. So these two, they really kind of they play off the best parts of each other. They're very much a yin and yang as foils, and I love sort of seeing their dynamic kind of make them more than the sum of their parts.
So it's kind of like an intro to the human psyche in a way.
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, I think our story, yes, there's that crime element and there's a lot of action to it. But I think, there's a lot of psychodrama to Spencer and Locke. I think our story is very much about sort of mental illness and depression and the lengths the mind will go to protect itself from harm. And so, yes, I think there's very much, sort of a psychological element, sort of saying that, you can take the boy out of the old neighborhood, but you can't take the old neighborhood out of the boy.
So, down the series, what can we expect?
Oh, plenty. Car chases, dangerous dames. We even have spaceships and aliens in the mix. I think the great part about our book is that because it's all about imagination and sort of this psychological landscape, we can take this book places that most crime noir can't go. Not only that, but we wear our influences proudly on our sleeves. And Spencer and Locke is very much our love letter to Bill Watterson and Frank Miller. So there's a lot of mythology that we can sort of do winks and nods to. But I think a lot of our series, we try to make sure that every issue stood on its own 2 feet, had sort of its own unique hook. And so I think we throw everything in the kitchen sink at our readers. And what's so great about working with an artist like Jorge Santiago Jr. is he nails all of it. And that was the goal, is we wanted this book to be kind of a portfolio for 2 young and hungry creators. Jorge's probably more confident about himself than I am, but I was afraid they wouldn't let me back in the building after this. So I said I better throw as much cool stuff into this book as I can before they throw me into comic book jail.
I've definitely been enjoying the art stylings. Can you tell me how you exactly got hooked up with Santiago and Smith?
Yeah, well, Jorge was. I was inspired a lot in the development of this book with the Strange Talent of Luther Strode by Justin Jordan and Trad Moore, and I really wanted to emulate a lot of that with this book because they were 2 sort of young, unknown creators who hit the scene in a big way. And the first thing I remembered was, Justin's best decision was pairing up with an artist as dynamic as Trad. And so I looked up, I realized that Trad was a graduate of the Savannah College of Art and Design. And so I said, well, if Trad if that's the kind of work that SCAD can produce, I should really look up some of the sequential art comic book schools. So I looked up SCAD, the Kubert School, RISD, SVA, and I remember Jorge's portfolio really standing out to me because he said that he made comics with stupid amounts of passion. And I feel like that's really important for indie comics. I think, it can be a hard path, and I think I'm pretty demanding as sort of both a writer, and I got my start in editorial, so I like to look at the big picture. And having that kind of passion and drive is so key, especially when you're working on indie comics, because it's all about love of the game. And Jorge just brought 110% to every single page. And I was just so fortunate that we were able to work together on this book, and I hope to ride his coattails for a very, very long time. So I'm glad that people are digging his work. As far as Jason, actually, it's funny. He was really the opposite kind of story in the fact that Jorge was a no-brainer for me, whereas Jason, it took forever to find the right colorist for this book. We had found a colorist who, at first, whose style wasn't really the right fit in terms of Jorge's inks, and then we found a second colorist who took the money and vanished. And I was really kind of beside myself at that point. I said, I think I posted on Facebook, I'm looking for a colorist. And thankfully, Taylor Esposito over at Ghost Glyph Studios, I'm Facebook friends with him. And he said, I got a guy, Jason Smith, who does work over at Hi-Fi. And the moment that Jason started turning in our preview pages, I said, oh, this guy, he gets it. He's got such this bold and vivid style that, Jorge's art is already amazing. but putting Jason's colors on it really brings it to the next level. I think working with the two of them, I think we really go toe to toe with really any creator-owned publisher out there. I think they'd be lucky to be working with a team like this.
Yeah, it's definitely a good team. Like the dynamics on the art and the writing is definitely a good fit.
Thank you.
How is working with Action Labs like? How's that like?
Oh, they've been great. I feel like, we shopped this book around quite a bit before we landed with Action Lab. And, I think just by virtue of the subject matter, it can be very touchy. I mean, I knew when I started developing this, that this was going to be a book that would rile people up. It's very much us serving sacred hamburger, extra rare. And I feel like there are some people, thankfully most people have understood kind of where we're going, but I knew there were going to be people out there that say, this is blasphemy. How dare you evoke Bill Watterson's name in vain? And I know we shopped this around to several publishers. I know one of them said it was the best pitch that he'd never published, which I take as a profound compliment. Mm-hmm. But Action Lab, they immediately saw what we were doing. And I remember I was at work. I was working on the pitch after work had let out, and I remember sending it to Action Lab, and I was catching up on some paperwork after hours. Maybe an hour later, I got an email back from our creative director, Dave Dwanch, who said, "How long do you think it would take you to finish this book?" And that's when this became real. Been behind us 100%. Since day one. And what's been great is they've really allowed us a lot of freedom to tell this story the way that we want to tell it, the way that we feel is most appropriate to tell it. And they've just, I think even in the creator-owned sphere, sometimes it can be difficult, and you can find publishers who will, they'll tinker, just because either for, business realities or sort of their own internal artistic compass, or just maybe, just to sort of feel more involved in the project. And it's a real testament to Action Lab that they've sort of let us go our own way with this book. And I think it's a much stronger product because of it.
It's definitely nice to find a company that allow artistic freedom. How long have you been working on the comic itself, like the idea?
I think the idea, I found a note on my iPhone just a few weeks ago, and the original idea hit me in September of, I believe it was 2014. I mean, it was a long time coming. And really, this book, it came very incrementally. It came in stages. Because I think you have to have a certain level of audacity to decide that you're going to write a book, that you're going to create something for wider consumption. And that's not really who I am. I sort of second guess everything that I do in order, as an editor. And so it just was sort of step by step. I said, okay, I'm going to write an issue just to see how I feel about it. And I really liked it. So I said, well, maybe I'll write a treatment for 4 issues just to see how, if I like that too. And that came across, and I was like, yeah, I really like this. I'm going to try to find an artist to sort of bring this to life. And I met Jorge and Jason and our letterer, Colin Bell. And I said, okay, let's do some preview pages, just see how it goes. And they looked amazing. That was sort of at the point where I started to think, okay, this, we might be onto something. Like, if we don't find a publisher, we might have to go to Kickstarter. I want to publish this thing out of spite, if nothing else. And we shopped it around, and suddenly Action Lab said, hey, we'd be interested. And suddenly this book wasn't a hypothetical anymore. And I'll be honest, it put the fear of God in me at first, because it's not just my reputation on the line, but I've got a great team who have really trusted in the work since the get-go, and that sort of made me feel like, okay, we got to bring our A game to this. We only get one shot, and we better make it a good one.
Yeah, we heard that you were you used to be a reviewer for Newsrama. How exactly did you switch from being a reviewer of comics to writing them?
Well, I think the skills are important for both positions. I think being able to analyze and break down comics day in and day out, that was really important for me as sort of in my development as both a consumer of comics and a creator of them. I think there's a method to it. There's a process, and across my tenure tenure at Newsarama, that's something that I've always been fascinated by, is how, what's the method that artists take in order to create their work. And something that was really important, I used to do an interview series called Writer's Workshop and Artist Alley. And so I got to interview a lot of really A-list writers and ask them just, how do you go about attacking a story? People like Rick Remender, Nick Spencer, Scott Snyder, Marjorie Liu, just to name a few. And sort of learning, Greg Pak is another big one. And sort of hearing from them, that really kind of helped me solidify my grasp on things like theme and characterization and plotting and pacing. But I think being able I think being a reviewer was really, it was like a comic book grad school for me in a lot of ways. I feel like, breaking down comics daily, it sort of forces you to confront your own biases. And it makes you it forces you to articulate, what do you like about comics? What don't you like about comics? I think, one big example is when done right, I think decompression can be a very valuable tool. And you see things like the first 2 arcs of Ultimate Spider-Man, or the current Supergirl being super, which I think is fantastic. I think it's a book at DC that more people should be reading. But I think more often than not, decompression has been misused. And I think what winds up happening, especially on month-to-month comics, is decompression. It builds you up for an event and a payoff that never happens. And so it sort of feels like a month-to-month bait and switch. And, one series that really kind of I really enjoyed as sort of a reaction to that was Cameron Stewart and Brendan Fletcher and Babs Tarr's run on Batgirl, where that felt very tightly plotted and every issue kind of stood in its own 2 feet. And you knew that there was a unique hook to every chapter, even if it fed into sort of this greater overarching storyline. And that was something actually that was a direct influence on Spencer and Locke, the way that we paced it and plotted it, because we wanted to make sure that our first issue, for example, really kind of played up the procedural mystery element and introduced our characters in this world. Whereas, without giving too much away, our second issue, that's our big car chase issue. And we have an amazing car chase sequence that Jorge and Jason just kind of knocked out of the park. And every issue has something along those lines, something unique that you'll be able to read this series and say, oh, I know this issue. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I really owe that to being exposed to so many different styles as a reviewer.
So how was it like working with the Newsarama?
It was great. I feel like, listen, Newsarama it's always going to be my home in some regard. And listen, there are people out there who have who have such a great tenure and track record across sort of a number of comic news sites. And for me, I've been fortunate enough that I've been able to sort of count one site as my home. And it's in part, I think a lot of reasons why I work so well with Action Lab is that, Newsarama, going back from Troy Brownfield, who was my first editor, to Mike Duran, who runs the site now, it's been so the trust that they've given me. I try not to take for granted. I think comics journalism is never going to bring home the big bucks for anybody, but I think it's all about what you put in. And for me, I've been so blessed because a lot of my best friends are people I met at Newsarama. People like George Marston or Pierce Lydon. These are people who they were reading Spencer and Locke scripts before Spencer and Locke even got their names. These you sort of, and I guess it's a hard thing to sort of convey to people who've never worked in a newsroom. And I got my start as a newspaper reporter, so I feel like there's this camaraderie that you build up by being in the trenches and having to hit deadlines and having to sort of survive a heavy editorial session. And no, I mean, listen, I got my start at Newsarama at the height of the recession. I was a broke college kid, or just graduated college, just finished up my internship at DC, had no idea what I wanted to do, no direction of where I wanted to go. And Newsarama gave me a home. And I'll always be grateful to them for that.
So being a reviewer, you can agree that there are many ways to review comics. So what exactly is your process when it comes to reviewing comics?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. First off, there are certain I guess there's a sliding scale, and I think tone is probably the most important thing in comics reviewing these days. I think there are some people who go very analytical, and they sort of really dig into the process and the execution. And then I think there's also sort of reviewers who they rely more on having a unique voice. And sometimes that can even sort of go to snark, which for me, I've always tried to steer clear from. And anyone who's ever written for me, I've always tried to steer them away from that, because this might come from my time at DC, but it's easy to forget that there's a human face on the other side of your comic. And even what you might think is the most phoned in comic in the world, chances are somebody worked their ass off on it. And so I always try to encourage reviewers in general to always look at a book based on the merits of the work and the execution, and to never to avoid making it a personal attack or even praise on a creator themselves. I think there's and I think the other thing is, even having spent many years at a big name comic site, you would be amazed at the things that you don't know about the comics industry. And I learn new lessons, at every convention that just blow my mind. I think, you only learn by doing. So I think there's definitely a humane way of reviewing books that can still be analytical and without being a jerk, if that makes any sense. No. I think for me, reading a book, granted, I've had a lot of practice at it, and I think practice makes perfect. But I try to read a book, and I immediately just, I try to do a gut check. I try to say, what stands out the most about this particular book to me, whether it's in the writing or the art. Try to boil that down into a thesis statement. And then you sort of have to interrogate yourself a little bit about that. You say, well, is this based on my own personal predilections, or is this based on something that's a little more objective? I think, and that almost comes across as a debate a little bit. You have to show your work, and you have to back up your arguments. And if you can't do that, then it might just be kind of like a knee-jerk thing, because there are certainly comics out there that are not for me that sell crazy numbers. Mm-hmm. And I mean, who am I to say that all these readers are wrong? And so you kind of have to put yourself out of your own shoes for a little bit and say, well, who's the market for this? Who's the target audience? And then sort of say, based on basic narrative fundamentals, is this something that might appeal either to this very niche target audience or a wider readership?
All right, last question. In reviewing process, one of my biggest complaints is the lack of focusing on art. Art is one of the biggest parts of comic books, but it just doesn't get focused on. How do you focus on art in your reviews?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I would take it a step further, because I think people look at the writers, and granted, this has been the case over the last 10, 15 years, because a lot of books are very writer driven. And it's been a debate that's been going on a lot lately with this idea of, do artists move the sales needle? And I think sometimes that's a problem with marketing. And I get that, because if an artist gets so big, suddenly they might not need you anymore, and they might say, I'm going to go off and do my own creator-owned thing. So I can understand why the big two are a little bit cagier with marketing their artists, as opposed to their writers, who they can share with their own creator-owned work. But I think when that happens, you find a readership and a reviewership that winds up minimizing the effect of art. And not only that, but even the individual components, things like inkers, things like colorists. When I was at DC, they really kind of hammered it into me how important each component of the art was. Having different inkers on a Jim Lee page, I've seen that GIF going around, and it's wildly different. Just seeing multiple inkers tackle the same piece. And colorists, I mean, a good colorist will make or break your book. I've seen it so many times, and I know I studied a little with Chris Sotomayor, and it was so helpful for me because that way I was able to talk with Jason kind of in his own language. And Jason and I would go back and forth. I mean, Jorge and I would spend pages upon pages emailing each other about like the best way to like lay out panels or the best way to kind of like tease out a sequence. But poor Jason had to deal with me so much more. We would IM each other middle of the night. You know, I'd say, hey, could we like crank up the saturation on this? And Jason would have to be like, well, this won't actually fit in like CMYK parameters. And we would go back and forth on so much detail. But going back to your question, I think you have to look at comics beyond just the soap opera story of it all. And I get it, like based on monthly frequency, it's easy to say, well, in this chapter, such and such happened. And I hate reviews that are just recap. I think, you know, that it feels like a Wikipedia summary to me. But if you look at the actual, like, I like looking at the execution, and I think the art, it's all execution. And so when you can sort of take a step back and say, well, these pages look really dynamic for this reason, or even just thinking of good adjectives to describe the art. Is it cartoony? Is it realistic? Is it moody? Is it shadowy? Is it fluid? Just to throw out a few out there. I think that's really important. And I think as a reviewer, I mean, I don't think many reviewers do it for the money. I think they do it as a way to be a little bit more interactive with their reading, a little bit more involved. And I think I would encourage reviewers to really kind of look at the art, even if they don't have artistic training, because I think very few do. But I think you should be able to look at comics in sort of a more holistic kind of way. And it's something that I always love it when I see reviewers doing that.
Definitely made some good points. When can we expect the next issue of Spencer and Locke?
Sure. The next issue of Spencer and Locke will be hitting stores Wednesday, May 31st. And I would really, listen, the thing I tell every reader who has bought our books, and we've done very well at C2E2 and local signings for me in Los Angeles, for Jorge out in Atlanta. I tell them, if you like our first issue, the biggest favor you can do us is to call your local comic shop. We're a 4-issue mini. So that's the big thing because indie comics, they live and die based on pre-orders. And we've been doing really well with our orders so far, and I'd love to see that continue. And I'd love to be able to tell more stories with these characters. I think they're really my boys, Spencer and Locke, in a lot of ways. And I think there's a much wider universe for them to explore, and I'd love for readers to see those stories.
I've definitely been enjoying it so far.
Yeah, very
much.
Interesting read and a very interesting take on the whole Sin City and Calvin Hobbes combination there.
Well, I feel like those are two artists, Bill Watterson and Frank Miller. I feel like I would not pretend that I'm fit to lick their boots. I feel like that both of them have forgotten more how to make comics than I'll ever know. But I feel like, putting the two of them together, it's like chocolate and peanut butter. And I hope that, we're definitely kind of a black comedy and definitely a parody. But I hope that readers see that this is also our love letter to two of the greatest cartoonists of our lifetime.
Thanks again for coming on Nerdent.net's podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
No problem.
No problem.
Look forward to reading your next book.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
No problem.
All right. See ya.
All right, that was David Pepose on his take on the reviewing world as well as his newest comic, Spencer and Locke. It's definitely an interesting read, and I've enjoyed it so far.
Yeah, folks, and if you want to know more interesting reviews with comics and also anime, manga, and many other more stuff, be sure to check out our website, nerdent.net, featuring a Spencer and Locke review. So be sure to check us out on our website.
So until next time, stay classy.
See ya!